I'm going to read you a list of novels, and I want you to think which of them are in the genre of fantasy literature. Okay? Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, Thomas More's Utopia, Life of Pi by Yann Martel, Ulysses by James Joyce, 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade, Hamlet, Shakespeare obviously, and Mary Poppins. Well, the answer is that all of them are fantasy literature, at least according to the critics. If you read books by academics over the last 20 years that claim to be about fantasy literature, you'll find discussions on all of these books. For example, if you look at Rosemary Jackson's Fantasy as a Literature of Subversion, she discusses all of these books, and she discusses just about every book ever written that's not explicitly realist, and calls it fantasy literature. And the most ridiculous thing of all is that just about the only text which she thinks is not fantasy literature is Lord of the Rings, and she says that's not fantasy, it's marvellous, and marvellous, according to her, is a kind of inferior category. So this is the problem that fantasy literature has. On the one hand, it's dismissed by most academics as not serious. They think it's merely escapist literature. On the other hand, those academics who do take fantasy seriously, they tend to focus on books that most ordinary readers wouldn't actually think of as being in the fantasy genre. And that's where my book comes in, because I champion the popular version of fantasy, the version that most academics wouldn't touch with a barge pole. So what is the genre of fantasy literature? I think the problem that critics such as Jackson have is they look at fantasy diachronically. In other words, they look at it as a historical genre over time. And that's how you end up with Mary Poppins and the Marquis de Sade in the same genre. I mean, it's just ludicrous. I think that we need to look at fantasy synchronically. In other words, we need to look at it as a kind of snapshot in time. So we should be asking, what is fantasy to us now? I mean, what does the reader find, what does the reader expect when they read a fantasy text nowadays? And I think it's really important to do this because it affects both how the books are written and how the books are consumed as well. If you take Terry Pratchett, for example, I mean, how can he write a send-up of the fantasy genre of The Quest, which he does in the Last Continent, if nobody has any idea what fantasy actually is? And in terms of how it's consumed, our understanding of what genre a text fits into leads us towards what is important in the text. I mean, think about detective fiction. If you know you're reading in the genre of detective fiction, you know what to look for. You know that you should be looking for clues. And it's no different in fantasy, really. So this is what I do in my book. I come up with a reader-led definition of fantasy that's based upon what readers understand as fantasy now, at this moment in time. I don't, of course, make any claim to some final or absolute definition of fantasy literature. Genres change, they're porous, they're matters of convention, so they change over time. But when we speak English, we don't mix Shakespearean English with modern English, when we speak to each other in English now. And in the same way, we shouldn't mix 120 Days of Sodom, Mary Poppins and Harry Potter when we talk about the fantasy genre.